Okay, I think we can start. People have entered the webinar. Welcome to today's seminar on ecology and evolution of Montpellier. Today we are virtually in Panama, so that's why the seminar is in the afternoon. And so we are 100% online. But the system is as every week. If you want to ask questions, you need to ask it on the Q&A. So you can either type your question on the Q&A, or you can ask me to ask a question, and I will open your microphone at the end of the talk. And now I let Nicolas introduce today's speaker.
So good afternoon and morning to everyone. It's really a great honor and pleasure to have today Helene Muller-Landau talking to us about a fantastic research on tropical forest ecology. It's a long career already, although you're still very young, Helene, but with numerous publications, very well cited work, over the last decades on biodiversity, forest structure and dynamics, forest modeling, forest function, and also remote sensing, where we're sharing some common interests there. So I'm really, really pleased to have you today to present this seminar with us.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Let me know if there's any problems with the slides or the sound, and obviously if there's clarification questions along the way. It's my pleasure to give a talk for this group today, and I'm just sorry I can't be there in person, although hopefully I'll make it there later this year for a visit. So I'm going to be talking today about several studies I've done related to the broader questions of patterns and mechanisms of spatial and temporal variation in tropical forest structure and dynamics. So to start, I want to step back and talk briefly about the importance of tropical forests. So the tropical forests are home to a majority of terrestrial species diversity, 2/3 of tree species, 3/4 of terrestrial vertebrate species, and probably an even larger proportion of arthropod species, which are not yet fully described. They also play a major role in the global carbon cycle. They're responsible for 1/3 of terrestrial gross primary production and hold 2/3 of terrestrial biomass carbon stocks, which means they also have important climate and hydrological feedbacks on the global carbon and climate systems. This means that in addition to the classic questions that ecologists have been asking ever since they kind of really started thinking about ecology of tropical forests, why are there so many species? What determines forest structure and dynamics in the tropics? There's also a key kind of applied question today, which is how will anthropogenic global change, and how is already anthropogenic global change affecting tropical forest carbon stocks and biodiversity? Because as rising atmospheric CO2, changing climates affect tropical forests, this then has the potential to feed back also on global carbon and climate. Insofar as increases in tropical forest productivity and carbon stocks would potentially take up additional CO2 from the atmosphere and slow the increase in atmospheric CO2. Whereas if there's a big increase in tropical tree mortality and a drop in tropical forest carbon stocks, this would accelerate the rise in atmospheric CO2 as more carbon is returned to the atmosphere. Now, as we think about trying to understand these systems, these complex forests, it's important to keep in mind that there's not just kind of one kind of tropical forest. Tropical forests are very variable across the globe. And one particular indicator of this is vegetation carbon stocks, or biomass carbon stocks. And this is one of various maps that have been published, all with some differences. Nicholas has done some nice publication on some of the limitations of those mapping approaches. But there's some broad similarities and patterns, and certainly all these maps show that there's a wide variation in tropical forest carbon stocks across forests we consider tropical. In fact, many-fold variation in those carbon stocks. And this is true for pretty much anything else we can look at across the tropics too. Productivity, tree mortality rates, biodiversity, they're all very variable across tropical forests. And unfortunately, we're still not very good at reproducing even that variability today, which is in part explained by climate and soils and so forth. And so if we look at, this analysis is from the CMIP5 models, because it was published a few years ago, but I understand the CMIX, I've talked with colleagues, and the CMIX-6 models unfortunately aren't much better. And if we look at observed biomass across tropical plots versus predicted, all the models do pretty poorly at that. And that's even more the case for spatial variation and woody residence time, which relates to tree mortality rates. So as we try to answer these big questions about what drives tropical forest carbon stocks and how will they change in the future, one of the key questions is kind of how can we explain this variation today? Because if we can't explain the variation today, then we don't have much hope of explaining variation with climate into the future. And of course, we will need to do more than just that to really predict carbon and climate and biodiversity into the future, because we're going past the realm of conditions found in forests today. So today I'm going to talk about 3 different sets of research I'm involved in or have been involved in that relate to this topic. First, I'm going to describe the results of a literature review I did a couple of years ago on pantropical patterns of variation. And I'm going to talk about some current ongoing research using drones to look at landscape level variation in tropical forest structure and dynamics in one site. And then talk about future directions, some work we're doing looking at trying to get a handle on interspecific variation and large-scale species level data collection by working to automate species identification. So the first part of the talk is related to this TANSI review I led a few years ago on patterns and mechanisms of spatial variation in tropical forest productivity, woody residence time, and biomass across tropical forests. So here we specifically looked at how patterns of these things vary with, and mechanisms with climatic water availability. So not just precipitation, but also drought stress related to dry season length, temperature and elevation, soil fertility, disturbance, and biogeographic realm. And then also reviewing what we know about the mechanisms underlying these patterns. And I came into this actually thinking that, I thought that we knew some broad patterns, but that other things were just going to be very idiosyncratic across sites. And it was really interesting to see what patterns turned out to be consistent and what didn't across studies. So the response variables we looked at relate to these sorts of drivers of ultimately above ground biomass variation. So part of this is understanding productivity. So there's the productivity measures of gross primary productivity of photosynthesis, net primary productivity, you take out respiration. And then often we don't measure all of net primary productivity, but only say above ground net primary productivity, which is doesn't include roots, or even just above ground woody productivity, which doesn't include leaf litter, flowers, fruits. And then ultimately, so above ground biomass is determined by this above ground woody productivity and how long that wood stays in the system, which is the woody residence time. And that's inversely related to mortality rates. So we were especially interested in kind of measures of productivity, woody residence time, and woody biomass. So first, just to make sure we're on the same page about what terms I'm talking about here. For biomass, we looked specifically at above ground biomass per area, which is referred to as AGB, mean canopy height, which is a good proxy for biomass in many cases, and the basal area of trees per area of ground. This is the cross-sectional area essentially of wood. If you just kind of think about slicing through the trees at about 1 meter above ground. So all of these were proxies for biomass that we looked at. And then we looked at the patterns of biomass with respect to climatic water availability, which we specifically looked at studies that evaluated patterns of biomass with mean annual precipitation or dry season length or climatic water deficit or dry season precipitation. For each of these sorts of variables, and I'm not going to go, this is actually the only one of these graphs I'm going to show here, but to give you a sense of how this study worked. So each of the rows here is a different study that was reviewed. And the bar on the right shows the range of, in this case, precipitation across studies. And then the color indicates the type of pattern. So blue means biomass was higher in wetter sites. Orange means it was higher in drier sites. Black means there was no relationship in mixed, which appeared once here means there was a variable relationship. For instance, it goes up and then it goes down. The statistically significant ones are indicated with asterisks, and bold indicates a median plot size of 1 hectare larger, which I consider to be make it more reliable. And then there's also kind of the number of sites included. So the kind of takeaway message from this is basically provided a way to visualize and say, okay, across all these studies, what's the overall pattern? And obviously there's a lot more blue than orange here. So the general pattern here is that biomass, canopy height, and basal area all decrease from wet to dry forests or increase from dry to wet forests. Although there's also some studies that go into the very wet end here where you could find for example, or that have variable things, suggesting that once you get wet to very wet, there might again be a decrease. Whether it's an asymptote or a decrease is somewhat unclear. So we can summarize that and this is the type of table I'll show from here on, so you won't see any more of those graphs. We can summarize those results in this way. So if we look at above ground biomass, canopy height, and basal area, and we kind of count up the number of studies that have statistically significant or a trend, but positive, not a variable. Again, here, the overwhelming pattern is positive, and that can kind of be summarized in this sort of graphic below. All right. Another set of variables we looked at related to productivity. So this included above ground woody productivity, which is essentially the woody growth of all the surviving trees, as well as the production of newly recruited trees. Alternatively, basal area productivity, which is more commonly available in older studies. Litter fall, so the production of leaves, flowers, fruits, that's inventory checked, usually assessed with traps like this. And then potentially combinations of these, such as above ground net primary productivity, which is woody productivity plus litter fall, or even adding in root productivity and gross primary productivity. These are much less commonly collected because they're much harder to do. When we look at these studies, once again, we find that most of the relationships studies that report a relationship find a positive relationship. Certainly almost all the significant ones are that way, although there's some that have either variable patterns or no significant pattern. So woody productivity especially seems to be higher at wetter sites, although it's less clear that that's the case for other types of productivity. So if we look at response variable, the next response variable we looked at was residence time. And there we looked at, in this case, the literature concluded two things for the study. So above ground woody residence time and turnover rate. And actually some of the other analyses also included mortality rate, which is just the rate per year per tree of death. Turnover is the average of the mortality rate and the recruitment rate. So again, how quickly are trees essentially cycling in and out. And we reported these so that higher woody residence time goes with lower turnover, and both of those then were reported as, so higher values means that the wood essentially stuck around longer, so mortality rates were lower in wetter sites. And there were far fewer studies of woody residence time than productivity or biomass. But again, in this case, there's a trend for a higher residence time in wetter sites, but not a lot of data on that overall. So putting this all together, we found that when we look at climatic water availability and talk about going from low to high precipitation, and generally productivity goes up at wetter sites, woody residence time may go up at wetter sites, but there's just not a lot of data, and biomass goes up at wetter sites. So in terms of thinking about the mechanisms of this, what's in the literature and what's hypothesized, the increase in productivity with water availability is typically related to increased leaf area index, longer growing season length. There's not a kind of dry season where productivity is lower, increasing photosynthesis per leaf area, higher increasing light use efficiency because trees don't have to pay the cost of drought tolerance, allocational shifts towards greater woody productivity, as they don't have to necessarily produce so much for roots, for example, compositional shifts in trees towards in terms of drought, not having to do with drought tolerance and fast growth, and potentially also compositional shifts with respect to lianas, which tend to be less abundant in wetter forests. The woody residence time patterns, this could have to do with the compositional shift towards shade tolerant, slow life history species at wetter sites and decreased abundance of lianas, but there's really not much on kind of the mechanisms here. And overall, given that we can basically estimate biomass as the product of productivity and woody residence time, biomass, then the increase in biomass is what we'd expect given the productivity and woody residence time trends. So this is the sort of review we did for water availability, and we conducted a similar review for, not exactly a meta-analysis. And studies are so different in how they measure things that I didn't think it was appropriate to combine them. But kind of looking at the consensus across studies in terms of the patterns with respect to a particular independent variable. So for water availability, again, as we go from drier to wetter, we get an increase in woody productivity, maybe an increase in woody residence time, and an increase in biomass. We did a similar sort of exercise with soil fertility. That was interesting. There was a very high agreement that productivity increases with soil fertility across sites, and that woody residence time decreases with soil fertility across sites. And there were very mixed relationships patterns reported for biomass versus fertility. Now that's actually what you would expect if you multiply an increasing function and decreasing function. You'd expect a unimodal relationship of biomass with soil fertility, where it's limited at low fertility by low productivity, and it's limited at high fertility by low residence time. So the inconsistent patterns across studies may relate to the fact that they're looking at different parts of this larger relationship. Although we didn't specifically assess this here, that would require being able to align soil fertility metrics across studies. The mechanisms of soil fertility in general, the higher productivity is attributed to higher tissue nutrient concentrations, lower allocation of nutrient uptake, higher allocation of wood, and potentially compositional shifts. But it may be dampened by higher lianas and higher natural enemy predation losses at high fertility. The decrease in residence time or the increase in mortality rates with soil fertility is typically attributed to faster dynamics, which includes you're growing faster, then the self-thinning is going to happen faster, as well as compositional shifts towards live fast, die young species, so fast species, and increased liana abundance potentially contributing as well. And then the biomass pattern fits with the combination of the productivity and residence time patterns. So what about temperature? So temperature doesn't vary very much across the tropics, but it does vary significantly with elevation. So I should say it doesn't vary in the lowland tropics. So most of the variation in the tropics is associated with elevation, which means it's not purely temperature variation. This is a bit of an issue in terms of interpretation, because there's other things that vary with elevation, including air pressure, cloud cover, precipitation, and soil fertility as well. So it's difficult then to clearly attribute what's driving potentially patterns of elevation. Nonetheless, if we put that aside for a minute and assume that this is mostly an issue of temperature, then general patterns here are a little bit trickier, but there's some evidence that there's differences in patterns for wet and moist versus dry sites, where with temperature, productivity increases with temperature and wet and moist sites, but decreases with temperature and dry sites because of increasing drought stress. That residence time patterns, there may be an increase in residence time in wet and moist sites with temperature, but possibly an increase with dry sites, really not clear. And the biomass, like woody product, that mirrors productivity, and then seeing an increase with temperature in wet and moist sites, but decrease in dry sites. The increase in moist and wet forests is attributed to higher metabolic rates, higher decomposition rates, and nutrient availability, and compositional shifts towards higher light use efficiency. Although the decrease in dry sites is related to drought stress. So if we think about elevation and temperature, there's a general pattern that woody productivity decreases, woody residence time increases with elevation, and that biomass decreases. Although this biomass pattern with elevation is actually quite variable across the tropics, and it's one where it'll be great to get better numbers on this as we get bigger data sets across the tropics. Disturbances we also looked in this review at disturbances in a qualitative way, and in general, higher disturbance rates are associated with lower residence time, so higher mortality rates and lower biomass. That's pretty much what we would expect. So the direct effect is that disturbance increases mortality, reduces biomass. And there's also a compositional effect, so repeated disturbance selects for low biomass functional types, shorter statured trees, faster cycling trees. If we go from lower storm to higher storm, we get this not much effect on productivity, but lower woody residence time and lower biomass. Now, the tropics, unlike the temperate zone, also have some interesting effects of biogeographic realm. And this is something that people in the temperate zone often don't think about, because in the North Temperate Zone, across all the continents, you basically get the same genera of trees and similar sorts of patterns of biomass. But in the tropics, there's very strong floristic differences across the 3 biogeographic regions. And there's patterns of productivity and biomass across these regions as well, which can't, to date at least, be accounted for just differences in soils and climate. So the mechanisms are still somewhat debated, but basically attributed at this point to floristic differences, so plant species composition, and potentially related to also differences in the preponderance of different mycorrhizal types and interacting animal taxa. Okay, so that review kind of was an attempt to see what we know kind of at the large scale in terms of patterns of climate. In the next part of the talk, I'm going to discuss some work I'm doing with drones, which is similar to some things that Nicholas is working on in French Guiana, and with an eye to looking at landscape level variation and as well as high temporal variation in mortality rates. So this was motivated partly by the results of that review and by some other studies. So when we have this wide variation of woody biomass across the tropics, and approximately, as I said, we can think of that as woody productivity times woody residence time when we're looking at old forests, that is. And one immediate question then might be, well, to what degree is the biomass variation driven by variation in productivity versus residence time? Empirical studies suggest it's driven much more by stem mortality, by mortality rates than by productivity. So, for example, this study from 2016 looked at a bunch of different plots in South America and found that higher stem mortality was associated with lower woody biomass across plots, which is the pattern you'd expect if woody biomass really dominates. There are some differences here across the regions, which probably relate to productivity. So there is an effect of productivity, but a lot more of the variation in woody biomass is essentially associated with the stem mortality than the productivity. And this is actually particularly unfortunate because our understanding of the mechanisms is much better for productivity than for mortality. And our data sets are also better for productivity than for mortality. So this begs the question, of course, what determines tropical tree mortality rates and their spatial and temporal variation? So one factor that plays a role, of course, is disturbance rates. So what's the frequency and intensity of storms, of droughts, fires, and flooding? Environmental conditions also likely play a role, so climate, topography, and soil more generally. And then, again, there's this issue of plant functional composition. Do we have a forest that has fast or is dominated by fast or slow species, fast growing or slow growing? What's the abundance of lianas or woody vines, which affect mortality rates as well as growth rates? And perhaps beyond just that fast-slow continuum, what is the resistance or resilience to particular mortality risk factors? So, for example, how does drought frequency interact with drought tolerance of the species in the site? And then, of course, there's a question of, okay, so there's a wide variation in mortality rates today. How is global change affecting mortality rates? And in a review paper some years ago, led by Nathan McDowell, we looked at hypotheses for various kind of drivers of mortality, and arguably a number of these are expected to increase under global change, including effects of droughts and thereby carbon starvation, lianas and fire, storm-driven mortality. There's also hypotheses for biotic agents. Competition and shade, less clear which way that would go. And there's some evidence for increases in tropical tree mortality over time, although this is inconsistent across sites. And again, the amount of data available is not what we'd like it to be. So this kind of importance of mortality intersects with our difficulties in actually calculating mortality rates or getting enough data on mortality from traditional ground censuses. So one key problem here is just that mortality rates are generally very low. We're looking at 1 or 2% for most species and sites, and they can be as low as 0.1% or lower, and at the highest end, like 5% per year. And that means, because it's this binomial process, we need larger sample sizes to estimate mortality rates well. Then we have the problem of high species diversity, which means that even if you have a big plot like BCI where we have a 250,000 trees censused every 5 years, the sample sizes for individual species and size classes are almost all really low. So again, we have then poor estimates, even though we know that mortality rates vary with size and species. So we can't constrain that variation very well. And then there's the issue that most plot censuses are done at intervals of 5 to 10 years, which means we have limited information on temporal variation, which might help us relate mortality to particular climate events, whether it's a dry year or a hot year or a year with a lot of storms. So we're tackling this in part with drones. And this is some of the people and drones we've used over the people who've been involved in drones in use over the years at our site. So basically, we fly the drones over the canopy and take a lot of plain RGB photos, although we've now moved to multispectral, and then use photogrammetry to reconstruct the surface of the canopy in this 3D point cloud. And we've had monthly flights, now weekly actually, since last year over the Barrow, Colorado Island 50-hectare plot. And this is an orthomosaic, so a view of all of that plot from above, as though from exactly above on one of those dates of those flights. And how does this let us look at mortality? Well, that canopy surface model lets us get the canopy surface elevation at each date. So here's an area on 2 successive dates. The color indicates the height. And then we can take the difference of those and say, okay, how did the canopy surface elevation, the top canopy height change from one month to the next? And we see there's this area where the canopy surface dropped a lot in height. And if we look then at the optical data at the orthomosaic, we can see that, yes, indeed, there was a tree fall in that area and some other related disturbances. Multiple tree crowns have disappeared from the canopy at that time. So we can automatically detect this canopy disturbances by aligning the data sets over time, and then we can kind of look at the imagery to understand what's happening and verify that our interpretation is correct. And Raquel Araujo, who led the first major paper we've had out of this data set, further than visually checked basically all the disturbances that were found to classify them as tree falls, branch falls, or standing dead trees that were decomposing over time. So in the 5-year period that was analyzed here from 2014 to 2019, approximately 2% of the plot was disturbed every year. And this is the full set of disturbances that were detected, including tree falls, branch falls, standing dead trees, and some that we didn't classify. And if we look at the temporal variation, we see that there's very strong temporal variation in disturbances, even given our somewhat, cruder, larger time intervals than we would like here. And in fact, this one period that saw the most disturbances in the whole time period, there was one very big storm in there. And if we had, daily or weekly data, that would probably be all concentrated even more into a single day or so, where half of the disturbances in a 5-year period took place. We looked more closely then also at the correlates of the disturbance rate variation over time. There was some seasonal variation, as has been noted previously at this site, with higher canopy disturbance rates in the wet season, although no significant difference within the wet season was detectable with our data set. And then we also looked more carefully, looking at each time period separately and looking at what aspects of rainfall or wind speed explain it. And just in a simple initial phenomenological analysis, looking at different threshold rainfalls, we basically found that the frequency of canopy disturbances, the rate of canopy disturbances increased with the frequency of extreme rainfall events during that period. So periods with higher numbers of high rainfall events had higher disturbance rates on average. So this kind of goes with what we'd expect based on variation. If wind storms drive a lot of the mortality, and the high rainfall events are an indicator of storms. The wind speed wasn't a good correlate, probably in part because wind speeds are higher in the dry season here, and those dry season winds are not associated with high mortality rates because they're more steady over time. In another study with the drone data, we went beyond the 50-hectare plot, which is kind of here in the middle, to all of Barrow, Colorado Island. So this is 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer area, 15 square kilometers in total. And this is work led by former postdoc Casey Cushman, who's now a scientist at Oak Ridge National Labs. So for Colorado Island, we have the 50-hectare plot here in the middle. It's not a huge size area, but it has considerable landscape level variation for such a small area. So there's actually 4 different soil parent materials on the island. This is the central Panama is geologically complex. So there's some plates that have smashed together there. And those different soil parent materials are associated with very different topography. So you can see that there's a lot more slopes in some of these areas than others. And also differences in soil. There's differences in soil form, and there are also some differences in forest age across the island, with basically the southwestern half of the island being old growth and the northeastern being 120-year-old secondary forest, 130-year-old at this point. So Casey took our whole island drone data for 3 separate dates in this analysis, 2015, 2018, and 2020, and quantified canopy disturbances using the same method used for the 50-hectare plot, except that it was a lot more complicated at the whole island level because of greater difficulty in aligning the data sets over time, considering the size of the data set. But she was able to detect all these canopy disturbances and zoomed in on the imagery to confirm that they were indeed disturbances, including one really large disturbance here on the southern Poacher's Peninsula in 2019. We then led an analysis of what explains the spatial variation in disturbance across the island, finding significant effects of both topography, so curvature, slope, height above drainage, as well as soil parent material and soil form, and secondary forests. So secondary forests had the lower disturbance rate than the old growth forest. And there were some differences between the 2 time periods as well. And when we kind of map the predicted differences out across the island, we find higher disturbance rate in the western side of the island, which is actually something that even naturalists had reported in the very early days of BCI. And quite a considerable variation in those rates across the island as a whole. Further, interestingly, we found that the disturbance rates predicted considerable variation these fixed effects explains considerable spatial variation in disturbance rates, especially at larger spatial scales. So at small spatial scales, we look at 1 hectare or so, it's very noisy, but as we get up to 50 hectares, we're explaining 50% or more of the variation of disturbance rates across 50-hectare blocks of the island. Further, in another analysis Casey led, we found that landscape level variation in canopy disturbance rates explains variation in forest structure. And this is forest structure even before we started this study. So back in 2009 from airborne LiDAR, we wanted to not make it sort of a truism like disturbance rate in this period explains forest structure at the end of the period. And so again, the correlation, the explanatory variable about that varies with the spatial scale, but when we get to these larger spatial scales where the noisiness is kind of no longer an issue, we find that we can explain approximately that about half of the variation in the proportion of the canopy that's low, the forest that's low canopy, is explained by the disturbance rates. So basically, we found that abiotic variation and the environmental variation explain a lot of the spatial variation and disturbance rates across BCI, which was consistent in these 2 time periods that we looked at separately, and that spatial variation disturbance rates in turn explained forest biomass canopy height and therefore essentially a proxy for biomass at these scales, which parallels previous findings on very large scale studies across South America that I reported on earlier, in which higher disturbance rates or higher mortality rates were associated with lower biomass at large scales. Okay, so I've talked about 2 studies we've completed while the drone work is ongoing, and we've got another 5 years of data now since some of those papers. So Casey's working on doing some more analyses to update that and look at consistency over time at this point. In this last section of the talk, I'm going to talk about the importance of interspecific variation and some work we're doing to try to work towards automated species identification and tree tracking in these data sets. So as I said before, to predict how global change will affect tropical forests requires understanding, how tropical forests function, what maintains diversity, and capturing that in mechanistic models so we can accurately project the future of tropical forests under alternative global change scenarios. And current models, as here's just one example from that graphic I showed before, are really don't do well with this at all. So why are current models so bad? Well, there's a lot of things that, still aren't fully captured, but I think one of the biggest issues is that there are lots of tropical tree species, and species are different in important ways. They differ in their traits, they differ in their performance in different environments, so they just differ in their responses to global change, they differ in their effects on ecosystem function. So for example, in the study in Panama some years back, led by Martijn Slot, temperature response curves of different tree and liana species were very different across species, with different sort of optimum temperatures and as well as different rates of change with temperature. So these differences are going to matter to responses to global change. And yet we don't have nearly enough species-specific data to really understand these differences well and capture them in models. The models require data to inform a lot of parameters, and we generally, there's maybe a handful of species where we really have all the parameters. So we're always kind of combining this set of parameters from this species and this set of parameters from those species and kind of taking an average across it, because we can ultimately, the models in their current form usually can only include a handful of functional types as well. So there's the computational challenges as well. You might say, well, how important is tropical biodiversity really? Couldn't we just stick with a few functional types? Well, I would argue that it's really critical in thinking about responses to global change, because of the fact that species differ in global change responses. And invariably, species that are most negatively affected, the kind of biggest losers under global change, will become less common and possibly even go extinct. That means that future forests are going to differ compositionally from the forests today. And it's one thing to think about that for a forest where you've got only a handful of species, so maybe the differences, the changes can't be that big. But in these tropical forests with hundreds of species, there is potential for really big compositional shifts. So if future forests are going to be different in composition than current forests, then that means we really need to understand those species responses and what that future compositional is going to respond to global change to be able to predict beyond just a few decades into the future. So then the problem is one problem let's put aside for a moment the computational challenge of modeling high diversity systems and say just the problem of how do we get enough species specific data? So traditional field studies, even the largest field studies using traditional methods, are small by modern standards because most species are rare. And even for relatively common species, sample sizes of critical life stages like large adult trees, which are so important for forest carbon stocks. Even though for common species, we don't have large sample sizes for a lot of that. And it's very expensive to scale up sort of these traditional field methods. It's very labor intensive. The species identification requires skilled personnel, and so forth. Now, remote sensing studies are really starting to transform, what we can do with tropical forests. And they're providing a lot of data now and promise to provide even more on stand level data. But they very rarely enable individual species ID with currently available methods. So we can get all this data at the stand scale, but it's not necessarily at this time going to help us with this problem of like, how do individual species respond? So fortunately, we live in an era where there's great technological advances, both in data collection options and in the software and computational tools for making sense of that data through artificial intelligence or AI. So there's new tools for data collection include hyperspectral imaging, where instead of just measuring in, say, red, green, and blue color bands that our eyes use and traditional cameras use, we can measure the reflectance in hundreds of narrow bands and look at variation, these essentially super subtle color variations among tree species that can sometimes be quite distinctive. So for example, here's a false color hyperspectral of part of the forest canopy on Barrow, Colorado Island. There's 3D scanning with photogrammetry and with lasers that captures three-dimensional structure in a degree that we haven't been able to in the past. There's camera trapping for animals and such, and acoustic monitoring as well, and eDNA for those. I'm going to focus on the plant part here. And then there's artificial intelligence and the ability to sift through large data sets and develop algorithms for species classification. And I would argue that this combination means there's a potential for transformative large-scale collection of species-specific data in tropical forests. So an example of the potential payoff, we have all this data on patterns of mortality across canopy disturbance across all of BCI, which we now have, and we've been getting annual data through last year, and now in new work led by Evan Gora, we're getting monthly data on canopy disturbances across all of BCI. So we have all this data, and we can also get information on the 50-acre plot. We now have weekly data, so we can look at canopy tree mortality, we can look at individual canopy tree growth, height, and crown area. We can look at leafing, flowering, fruiting to quantify responses to temporal climate variation. But what we want is to be able to do that then for individual trees and assign it to individual species. And that's really becoming into the range of the possible now. In work, a couple algorithms released last year have made it much more possible to automatically segment individual tree species. So this is one tree being followed over 6 dates with the automatic segmentation. So that means that we can automatically follow an individual tree over time in a way that we weren't able to previously, and track changes in crown area as well as texture and color. So if we can do that, across that all of BCI, we're talking about 60,000 reasonably sized canopy trees that could potentially be tracked every month. So the analyses to date that we've done with our data are stand level, lacking in linked to species identity, but we need to identify individual trees. We need individual tree IDs, I would say, to understand how species performance differentially responds to climate variation in different species. So why might we automatically identify canopy tree species? Is this just pie in the sky, or can we get there? Well, there's a number of examples where this has been done already. And I think, and there's potential from multiple different tools. So one is distinctive flowering. And this dates back to the earliest study of this was over 10 years ago with Colorado Island, Tababuya guayacán, now Androanthus guayacán, which flowers a brilliant yellow. It's actually not included here because the sample size wasn't large enough in this study. But basically, there's some species that are so distinctive, so brightly colored in their flowering that if you capture remote sensing data, whether that's drone or satellite at the right time, you can basically say, that is Jacaranda copaya, or that is Dipteryx oleifera. With monthly data for all of BCI, we have the potential to do that there, and certainly with weekly data for the 50-hectare plot, we expect to capture most flowering events, so that the subset of species that have distinctive conspicuous flowering or fruiting or new leaves are potentially identifiable in this way. Another is potentially sees distinctive patterns of seasonal deciduousness. Now this is our site has a 4-month dry season. So a subset of species go deciduous during that time period. That deciduousness at the least can tell us, can narrow down the number of which species that tree is likely to be. And there's some species whose deciduousness is so distinctive in timing. So for example, there's 2 that have much longer deciduousness than everything else, that we can really narrow down and potentially ID species with that, or at least greatly narrow which species that could be. A third possibility is distinctive hyperspectral reflectance. This has actually been promised as like the holy grail for a couple decades now, and hasn't quite gotten to fruition, partly I think because it's not as easy as we had hoped, and not every species can be distinguished when you have all these species. But there's definitely some species that can be identified as species within sites like Colorado Island from hyperspectral reflectance. And there's more, again, where we can greatly narrow which species it could be. You know, if we can get it down to 5 different species, for example, that in itself would be quite valuable in terms of linking data sets that would otherwise be stand level or without species identity to species traits or taxonomic identity. And this, again, basically relies on this variation in reflectance across many different wavelengths. Then there's another possibility, which has not been explored much so far, but I think it's definitely worth exploring, is distinctive 3-dimensional structure. And so when we think about how expert botanists identify trees, both canopy trees and seedlings, a lot of it is actually the sizes of leaves, the orientation of leaves, the way the leaves are positioned on the stems, the way the branches are arranged. So 3-dimensional structure. And in the past, that's been something that's hard to capture in data, but laser scanning methods and now also photogrammetry now make it possible to capture 3-dimensional structure of plants in a much more precise manner. There's been a few studies in temporal course so far showing that AI can be trained to automatically classify tree species from that three-dimensional structure captured in laser scanning. And so all of these things, each of them, I don't think any of them is going to be the silver bullet or the way on its own to let us identify all or even most of the tree species in a tropical forest that has hundreds of tree species. However, each of them can narrow the range of possibilities, and some combination of these characters might then allow species to be distinctively identified. For example, if we can narrow which species it is based on deciduousness and then look at hyperspectral, and that combination may tell us which species it is for some species. Or the flowering might narrow it down to 3 species, and then the 3D structure does further, or so forth. What we need at this point, I think, is a really concerted effort to collect these sorts of data for a large number of tree species at a site and explore the information content of these different data types and which are most useful for discriminating tree species and which we should be pursuing going forward. Now, I focused so far on canopy trees, which are super important for forest carbon, but definitely not the only thing that's important. Because especially as we think about forest regeneration in the future, we need to know which species are successfully recruiting the seedlings, the understory plants. So here, 3D structure, I think, is probably the most useful potential approach. And again, these methods that are now used for stand level terrestrial laser scanning, for example, capture particularly detailed information on those seedlings and saplings, which are close to the ground and close to where the scanners are operating. And so I expect that there will be at least some subset of species where the seedlings are sufficiently distinctive that we can automatically classify them with AI and potentially take laser scanning data for a stand and get a complete census of all seedlings of particular species, seedlings, saplings, trees across that stand. This potential is relatively unexplored as yet. So my lab is doing working on a number of things to kind of try to advance this. We're developing and publishing crown maps with species labels so there's a data publication for December, linked from my website. It's on Smithsonian Figshare, that basically is throwing out there for anyone who's playing with satellite data to say, hey, can you figure out how we can identify these species from satellite data? Here's a high quality ground truth data set on what you're looking at. So that's, for example, the 50-acre plot. Each of the times we've done that, we have over 2,000 crowns, about 25 meters squared of approximately 130 tree species, depending on the census. We're also working in collaboration with Antonio Ferraz, NASA JPL, and Sarah Beery at MIT on specifically exploring the ability to classify deciduousness states and flowering and fruiting states and potentially some selected individual species from high-resolution satellite data and time series. So that's looking at this, focusing especially on conspicuous deciduousness or conspicuous flowering. It could even be done from space. Obviously, if we can do it from satellites, then that opens up even larger possibilities than the drone data. And then a grant that I recently obtained, a small grant for a pilot study that we're just getting going. I'd be eager to get advice from people on how best to approach this. We're collecting high quality training data for 150 Colorado Island tree species on hyperspectral reflectance of fruits, flowers, barks, and leaves. There's actually a lot of previous data collected on leaves, but almost nothing on flowers and fruits, which I think is another critical component in relation to time series. And then 3D scanning of plant parts and whole plants, again, looking at the potential for, and including seedlings, of distinguishing species from laser scanning or photogrammetry data, such as might be collected by drones and terrestrial laser scanners. And then the plan is to quantify within species variation between species distinctiveness in each of these types of data sets and train and evaluate classification algorithms. So in closing, kind of that first section on the literature review, an understanding of the patterns and mechanisms underlying spatial variation in carbon stocks and fluxes today is critical for predicting the future of tropical forest carbon budgets under global change. There are relatively consistent patterns of variation with respect to precipitation, temperature, soil fertility, disturbance, biogeography, on woody productivity, residence time, and biomass across tropical forests. And in the case of each pattern, hypothesized drivers have been identified, and they always include 2 elements. One is kind of direct effects, and the other is shifts in functional composition, including through changing abundance of lianas, which highlights that importance of the species component. On the drones, Again, understanding rates and mechanisms of tree mortality is critical. Repeat drone photogrammetry provides a nice way to quantify canopy tree mortality at fine temporal resolution and large spatial scales, and thereby link it to climate variation and spatial variation in biotic drivers. And that's led us to some specific conclusions regarding the BCI data in terms of its temporal and spatial variation disturbance. And then the ongoing work with species ID. The future of tropical forests under global change depends on individual tropical plant species responses. We need a lot more species level data to assess those well. Technological advances have some promise in helping us get those sorts of data. But we need to realize that we need to collect and publish a lot of high quality training data and work on developing automatic classification tools and in investing in associated data science capacity. So I'd like to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to this, both co-authors, technicians, interns, collaborators, as well as funding sources with Smithsonian and USDOE especially. And I thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions and also by follow-up email. You can just find out more about this work on my website if you're interested. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Helene. It's fantastic, really great work. While others are preparing their questions on the Q&R, I already have one or two questions I'd like to ask.
Go for it.
In the first large-scale study, the literature study survey you did, I was wondering, you mentioned that there was possibly, there was obviously an interaction between the temperature effect and wet and dry sites, but also for soil fertility, you could expect that there would be an interaction between leaching, the amount of water falling, and soil fertility, right?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So, so certainly that's actually one of the hypothesized drivers of why once there's more data, it might be expected that soil productivity would go down again with really high rainfall. But certainly, this was a study where we, took basically what was in the literature. And so in some cases, the analyses controlled for other factors like soil fertility, and sometimes they didn't. That was just, but yes, I agree that there's a confounding in terms of different combinations of variables. You can't find really wet forests with really high soil fertility in general. Well, they're super rare, I should say. Why does have it? So yes, that absolutely is something that has to be taken into consideration in terms of interpreting some of these patterns.
Okay, thank you. I have other questions, but I'll let other people ask theirs.
We have one question by Raphael. You should be allowed to talk.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Helen, for your talk. It was a great, refreshing talk. As much as I know, most species and potentially biomass comes from the understory. What would be the role of canopy trees on their dynamics and canopy dynamics? And if canopy dynamics are considered a proxy of understory dynamics in this case?
That's a good question. So most trees, like when you look at trees above a certain size threshold, most of the trees are certainly in the understory. But if you convert it to biomass, actually, and so I think one of the few analyses I know that's done this, another paper led by Raquel Araujo based on her work in Manaus, we actually took that crown map and computed, the biomass for different canopy strata. And actually a majority of the biomass is trees that are in the canopy. So with their crowns in the canopy, because biomass is disproportionately in the big trees. So from that point of view, capturing the canopy certainly tells us something, but it doesn't tell us everything. As you said, there's a lot of considerable biomass in the understory as well. So I would say there's two aspects there. So one is, as you probably probably one of the things you were thinking is that if a canopy tree falls, it affects the understory. And so just as a first proxy to some degree, we can basically look at effects on understory from looking at what happens on the canopy. I would say more generally, these sort of photogrammetric drone methods that we're using, we're getting, the full change in canopy height. So we can already kind of change it into a sort of proxy, look at one of the things, ongoing studies we're doing actually right now is looking at the degree to which we can predict biomass changes from the canopy height changes that we're seeing by combining it with ground data on mortality that includes understory individuals. And that's a little bit messier than it's definitely been messier than we had thought it would be initially, but it's partly actually because of difficulty in aligning the data sets and the quality of the data sets in both ends in terms of the ground data not being a complete census of everything. But I don't want to get too much into the detail there. But certainly I think the next step beyond photogrammetry is to use drone LiDAR and LiDAR more generally to look at these changes. And then we would, of course, be able to quantify changes to some degree, at least in understory biomass as well. And I think that's definitely where we should be going. It's a lot more expensive to run drone LiDAR, and it's also hugely larger data sets to keep track of and such over time. So we haven't made that shift yet, but I hope we will at some point.
Yeah, and it could also be useful to use the census data to make some cross analysis.
Exactly. Yeah, so the work I mentioned, which is led by a former intern, Luisa Gomez, is looking at the repeat mortality and damage census on the ground in relation to the canopy disturbances and how those relate.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I see a question and answer, and it says, oh, Johan, you said that your sound is not very good, or you want to say it?
Yeah. Can you read the question, please, Elena?
Sure. So the question is, you mentioned 3D structure of trees. I'm surprised you did not mention explicitly architecture models. It seems you may have the right data to test if AI can indeed lump trees in a number of discrete groups that may fit known architecture models, corners, Aubervilles, etc. Yeah, this is a great question. I didn't mention it because it's not specifically related to what I was doing, but I'm super excited about the potential to use this laser scanning data that's now becoming easier to work with to look at tree architecture in a much more quantitative way and potentially get back to these models from many years ago. I think it's actually quite unfortunate. So that, many decades ago, people recognized that tree architecture was an important component of certain tree strategies. But they've kind of been, I think, overlooked and pushed aside in the whole functional traits literature because people are like, well, it's easy to go out and sample the leaf, right, and measure its nutrient content and leaf mass per area and leaf size and so forth. So we have all this emphasis on these sort of functional traits that are things like, you can measure on a leaf you take off the tree. And I believe that architecture is likely to be at least as important, especially for some of these things that are poorly parameterized in global models, like the amount of woody loss as a tree grows, like turnover. So if you think about as a tree grows up, right, a lot of the naive models, actually, one of the reasons they do well is they often basically assume that trees just add biomass over time without kind of the loss of biomass. So in reality, a tree doesn't take its small crown and kind of push it up into the canopy and make it bigger. It grows another set of branches on top and loses the branches underneath. And so that means there's a woody loss as you grow that's an extra cost of biomass production that's often not really captured or captured in an extremely crude manner in the global models. And I think to capture that much better, we need an understanding of tree architecture and really in a quantitative way. So we can say, okay, how much is lost as you go up? And so, yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how we can, I think there's certainly, I'm not the only person to say this, a lot of people have pointed out that there's great potential to get back to architecture with these 3D sort of data sets.
I have another question, if I may.
Sure.
You were mentioning the effect of wind speed on tree mortality. We're very interested. We're starting actually new monitoring sites in Africa with Evangora, the Gigante project. So we'll see onwards what it looks like. But was it average wind speed you were using, or maximum wind speed? Obviously, would be an important predictor, but I didn't catch well.
Yeah, so we were looking at maximum wind speed within 15-minute intervals, and it wasn't very predictive in this sort of phenomenological analysis we did with the temporal variation. But as I said, I think that's partly so. In that analysis, we only had like 50 or so data points, basically 50 time periods. So I was hesitant to try to fit any complex models because I was worried about overfitting. But I would say there's kind of 3 issues we were confronting with that data. So one is, as I said, in our site, wind speeds are higher in the dry season. So there's just the trade winds below in the dry season. So if you just kind of look across all days, like there's higher wind speeds in general in the dry season, but mortality rates, like the turnover rates, are lower in the dry season. So in fact, the prediction ended up being kind of backwards, where it was like lower wind speeds associated with higher mortality rates. So that's just kind of where it's, the correlated factors are a problem. But another issue probably is that, so I think we'd have to look at, okay, it's a certain type of wind, not all winds, like steady winds are not as bad as kind of gusty winds and so forth. So it's more about the turbulence than the wind speed per se. So what we're actually exploring going forward is using convective available potential and energy, or CAPE, which is a measure of storm strength that's actually in some of these global climate databases. Well, in the global climate reanalysis data sets, give it at the kind of cell scale of, potentially 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer. And we're hopeful that that might provide a better measure of sort of the storm strength and the types of winds that would kind of cause tree mortality, and that could play a role. The other thing, actually, just with the wind data for BCI, and this is very specific to the site, is the wind data we were using are from the northeast side of the island, and the predominant, it seems like the disturbance rate is higher on the west side, so it's actually shielded from westerly winds. And we do have data for the center of BCI, but that's eddy covariance, and eddy covariance data, wind speed data, isn't good when it's raining, because the raindrops change the speed of the sound. And so basically we didn't have wind speed data of the right kind, I think, maybe to capture it as well.
Okay, so the wind sensors are too perfectionate. We need just simpler.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I feel like maybe the wind sensor at the top of the island, that's not a sonic anemometer, a traditional one instead, would do better. But also, I think these gusts are so spatially variable, though. When you do get these wind blowdowns, right? It's not like necessarily it's everywhere. It's like one spot. So that's where something like convective available potential energy, which tries to get at the bigger picture, might be more useful.
So just install windmills everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see us building towers like on every hectare of VCI and sticking, sensors up there. So I think it's going to be a while before, we do any better than the convective available potential energy sort of stuff.
Thank you. Any other questions online? Everyone is online anyway.
I'm afraid there's no more question online.
Okay. We had a great attendance at some point. We
Yeah,
were nearly 60.
we had 63 participants today, which
Great.
is a very good score for an afternoon seminar.
Just before
Even
holiday.
for a morning one, actually. So
Yeah, apologies
very good
about
score.
the non-standard.
Don't
I
worry.
appreciate that you guys could shift it a bit for the time.
It's better than to take the flight and put carbon in the atmosphere. So.
Yes, although I hope that I'll have a chance to chat in person with more of the folks there before too long.
That'd be great.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks to you.
Thanks so much.
Have a good weekend, everybody. And we have a 1 week break with the seminar. The next one will be the 19th of April. Bye-bye.
Ciao.